thank you everyone for joining us today. We are recording this from the World Economic Forum in Davos, and it's our honor to be hosting our panelists today. And the purpose of our conversation is to talk about carbon trading and voluntary markets. Carbon trading, is it the right strategy towards decarbonization? And that's what we're going to try to answer at the end of the day. I'll set up the context. And as you probably already know, achieving net zero targets and require lowering our CO2 emissions, right? And avoiding these emissions at all. And that's the challenge that the world is going through today. CO2 needs to be compensated, which typically happens by buying carbon credits. Complexities, there's a lot of suppliers, marketplaces, and processes that makes it only challenging. There's a lot of manual errors as well, and lack of transparency most of the times. So if it wasn't enough, greenwashing is looping everywhere. And there's a trust issue at the end of the day, a trust foundation, which makes it only complex. Decarbonization for many companies include mandatory markets where carbon tax must be paid, and these are called or referred to as allowances. These allowances allow companies to offset their CO2 and typically on scope 1 emissions. But for other companies who do not fall under these regulations, it's a voluntary carbon market. And so today's discussion is about exactly that, voluntary carbon market. Carbon offsetting follows the concept of compensating or offsetting. And today I'm honored to be welcoming our panelists, and I will start introducing them. Alexsandra Guerra, next to me, is co-founder and director corporate development at Nori, and we will learn more what Nori is and the purpose of Nori. Christoph Lange, co-founder of Atem, and Alexandre Peschel, co-founder of Atem as well, and Daniel Schmid, our chief sustainability officer at SAP. And Alexandra, I'll start with you.
Sure.
Yeah, so tell us about Nori. What makes you start this business, and what is Nori's role into reversing climate change?
Oh, I love this question. Super easy for me to answer. So we focus on voluntary market carbon removal offsets. And this is not always a given. We've been around since 2017. And I'm a co-founder, and my co-founders, we started Nori because we saw that the current carbon market system was broken, and it wasn't also helping to achieve a huge need, which is to scale carbon removal. 95% of the voluntary carbon credits represented either avoiding or reducing emissions. So essentially getting paid for not having emitted, it's a useful strategy in decarbonization. But we really saw the need to scale up massively. How much carbon are we removing and sequestering from the atmosphere as quickly as possible? And so we thought markets can move trillions of dollars. Let's create a carbon market where anybody who's removing carbon could create a methodology on our marketplace. It would be peer-reviewed, third-party audited, quantified, and then sold on a completely transparent process on the blockchain through Nori's marketplace. We started this in 2017. And it's complicated, right? I think this is not such a straightforward problem to solve. And we spent 2 years really researching what the current or the existing registries were doing, interviewing verifiers who did that process, understanding what the process looked like from their end, understanding the problems, and trying to innovate a new model for it. 2 years before we sold our first credit in 2019 with one farmer. Right now, we are working with regenerative agriculture. So we've helped over 18 farmers get paid for an additional $2 million in revenue for sequestering carbon by adopting regenerative agriculture practices. But that's just one method. There are many other methods of carbon removal that we will bring on board.
And you mentioned farmers. So what is the role that farmers play at Nori's, and why are they so keen and important to your mission?
So a third of our greenhouse gas emissions come from the way that we grow our food. It's from tilling our soil, and the soil is degrading. So there's two big global problems that need to be addressed with taking care of our soil through our agriculture system. It's one, a third of our greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, global warming. The second is that the topsoil is eroding. So we're losing the ability to grow food on that soil, and therefore we're losing food security in our supply chain. So farmers are very desperate to find additional forms of revenue that will help them make the switches to transition from conventional to regenerative agriculture practices. These practices are like doing minimal or no-till. It's cover cropping, keeping your soil protected when you're not using it. It's applying organic compost instead of synthetic fertilizers. It's a suite of practices. There's no one rule or one size fits all. You have to really look at your farm and assess your region and what works for you. But the idea is to allow the soil to grow in its organic content, which is the carbon going from the air via photosynthesis through the roots of the plant into the ground, growing more organic content. That's carbon storage and sequestration.
That's so interesting. I'll jump to Atem here on my right-hand side. And Alex, tell us about how did you guys started the business and what makes Atem unique?
So when we were thinking about starting Atem a little over a year ago, we looked also at carbon markets, how it was operating, and we found that there are like essential things missing in the market. And I think the challenge is clear. We need to get to a state where we remove billions of tons of carbon every year from the atmosphere. And we're very far away from that goal. And we don't believe that the infrastructure is set up for this level of impact scaling, basically. As you mentioned, it's data silos, it's manual processes, it's lack of trust. And lots of those issues are preventing the market from scaling and ultimately us from reaching that goal or getting meaningfully closer to that goal. And with Atem, what we want to do is we want to provide access for enterprises to the on-chain carbon market. So we believe that this new infrastructure of tokenized carbon credits that you also hinted at is going to be crucial for that level of scaling, because ultimately we need more automation and we need more integration, we need end-to-end processes. And when we looked at carbon markets, what we found out is that managing carbon is not an integral part of business operations. It's kind of a separate entity or separate team, basically. And we believe it needs to be integrated and it needs to be kind of put into the heart of how businesses are operating in the future.
Christoph, how do you close the gaps that he has mentioned?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really starts with what Alex already mentioned, the tokenization of carbon credits. So if you think about it, a carbon credit, what is a carbon credit, right? It's a line in a database. It's a piece of information, currently at least. And what happens when you tokenize these carbon credits is essentially you do an upgrade. Similar to, now you have a piece of software that lives on a blockchain or a decentralized ledger, and that unlocks a whole range of opportunities or features and functions. So it's a bit like an operating system that you can now work with. And that means, well, for us, really, most importantly, two things. On the one hand, it's a lot easier to verify what is going on, right? You don't have to trust a single entity, the database owner, if you will, or the person that claims, we have so and so many carbon credits that we issued and so and so many have been retired. You can now that it's a token on a blockchain, on a decentralized ledger, you can verify for yourself. You don't have to trust as much. So that's one thing. We get closer to this ideal version in the future. We're still far away. We get closer to this ideal version of the voluntary carbon market where we don't have to trust as much and we're able to verify. That's the first thing. And the second thing is what Alex mentioned, the automation and the integration. We can now use this piece of software and integrate it through our API, for example, through Atem's API, deep into business processes, into procurement processes, into financial processes, etc. Because we believe for the carbon market to scale, or for this impact to scale, it needs to become sort of the default thing that you do as a business. It needs to be easier to do good, quote unquote. And yeah, that's why we are very much believers of this new infrastructure that makes it possible to build upon and really do this in a sort of modern, automated and integrated way.
If you may allow me, I would like to phrase it a little bit differently, because you said, based on the technology, I would say you build trust, and building trust in that environment of the voluntary carbon market is so crucial for the stakeholders. And I believe we all agree that it was and still is a lot of criticism about that. So building trust is key, and for that, the technology helps to build that trust.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And trust continues to come up, right? And especially during this week, trust is a key foundation of all conversations, and you cannot buy trust.
Yeah.
You have to earn it,
Yeah.
right? Maybe a question to all of you, now that we know Nori and we know Atem a little bit more. What is your vision on voluntary carbon markets? What is each one of your vision, if you want to comment on that? Daniel, maybe you want to start?
Yeah, I'm happy to start, and let me start with not painting the vision, but mentioning what we are doing and where we are experienced in on our journey, which is more than a decade old. We always came up with the ambition first to apply a science-based approach, and second to follow an approach to avoid emissions, to reduce emissions, and then to compensate what is left over. And this sequence is quite important. And that helps as well to build trust, that you don't just focus on the compensation piece and the offsetting, but really challenging your business model, challenging your processes, and really avoid emissions, doing things in a different way, being more efficient, meaning reducing emissions and then compensating what's left over. When it comes to compensation, at SAP, for us, it's important to look at the different time horizons. So one example, many, many years ago, we decided to invest in the livelihoods fund. And we did this now for the third time. And this is a long-lasting offsetting approach with always the focus to ensure it's not only the offsetting and getting the carbon out of the atmosphere, but as well ensuring the social economic benefits coming out of that. So looking at all the three dimensions, the social, the environmental, and the economic dimension, and community building there. That is for us crucial, applying things like the gold standard of ERA. And Livelihoods Fund is giving us credits over a time period of more than 20 years back in our carbon balance sheet. And then for the more mid-term horizon, the LEAF coalition is super interesting for us, where we are engaged. And then, yes, we have as well some specific carbon offsetting engagements, more short-term driven. But that explains a little bit our journey, that explains our strategic approach. And of course, from a vision, coming back to your question, it's really crucial that people believe in what companies are doing based on great offerings from your side and technology, creating that transparency which is needed.
Alexandra, how do you see the voluntary carbon markets, and what can you share with anyone who's watching and learning more about what Nori's do?
Yeah, I want to piggyback off of that. One of the terms we coined earlier on was emit less, remove the rest. The first part is to emit less, do everything you can to reduce your emissions, and then, like you said, compensate or pay for the carbon removal. And then another thing I think that's really important here, we already touched on this, is transparency. So Nori is a blockchain-backed marketplace. It depends on the audience. So I'm the head of demand and business development and sales. So I talk to various different stakeholders, and depending on where you are, the blockchain might be a really interesting aspect, but it isn't the primary point. The point is that we are removing carbon from the atmosphere. So you don't have to be afraid of that. You don't have to know how the HTTPS protocol works in order to go to Amazon.com and buy, the jacket that you need to come to Davos because you live in warm weather. So technology, I think, is key to providing transparency. And from Nori's perspective, anybody who purchases carbon removal from our website, which you can do at nori.com, even as an individual, if you want to remove your carbon emissions from your flight here, organizations can purchase there as well, or you can talk to us. You get a certificate that says your name on it, and it's attached to your project. So a lot of voluntary marketplaces will give you a certificate, but we could do that in Paint on our desktop. The really powerful thing that we provide is the link to the project. And that project page is updated as it's being verified through its lifespan. Complete transparency. So Nori uniquely has built a vertical solution. So building up. So at the bottom here is a supply. We work directly with farmers, for example, right now. We work with the farmers. We get third-party auditing and quantification, but we coordinate with this. Then we create on-chain carbon removal offsets. We call them NRTs, Nori removal tons. Right now, they represent 1 ton of CO2 removed and stored for a minimum of 10 years. And then we sell these either on Nori.com or on our API that we're releasing the next month and 2 months. There's 2 different versions. So technology and transparency are key to that. And the fact that we built a completely vertical solution allows us to provide complete transparency to all stakeholders involved. And I want to say something about the technology aspect. There's a nature and a way of thinking for anybody in tech, which is agile. It is to always iterate, to have a tight feedback loop. It's to improve and not assume that once you've done the job, it's right forever. You always have to be releasing new versions, new operating systems, etc. This is known. And I don't think that we've had that concept within the voluntary carbon market space. And this is what new startups like Nori and Atem and others are bringing in, which is, even when Nori started in 2017, we had this idea that a ton is a ton is a ton is a ton. Doesn't matter if you remove it from the ground in regenerative agriculture, it'll cover your emissions. And we've adopted that. We've learned, because new science has come out, that there's a difference between the fast carbon cycle and the slow carbon cycle. And Nori's NRTs right now from regenerative agriculture are coming from a life cycle, the fast carbon cycle of organic matter, natural. It doesn't necessarily cover your emissions that come from burning fossil fuels on your flight over here. But we have a lot of access to supply and a lot of opportunities to innovate here because our rainforests are out there, our forests are out there, our farmers are farming. We need to take action now, immediate action, while planning and investing for long-term technical solutions that will cover slow carbon cycle.
Let me build on what you just mentioned about, first, we definitely need that agile spirit from you, from the startup community, definitely, to further improve and continuous improvement of the technology. And what you mentioned about getting the people on board by regularly updating the data. And an experience we just made 3 weeks ago, we launched internally at SAP, we call it the tree tracker, allowing this visibility for all our 110,000 people to see in the concrete projects we are invested in. And with geospatial data, so really zooming in the specific space where trees are planted, as an example, describing which kind of species of trees are planted, ensuring biodiversity,
Yes.
The social economic benefits coming up with that project, and regularly updating that. And that is super. Yeah, I love it. The people love it. We first demonstrated that in our champion network, Sustainability Champion Network around the world. It resonated so well. And of course, we apply SAP technology with our SAP Analytic Cloud software solution. And this is where now already through engagement with others, I think about why not open it up to the public, yeah? Mm-hmm. We started that journey internally, but that is so powerful and helpful because then people believe in these investments.
Yeah.
It's the next iteration.
I think that's a very important point. And actually also, when we talk about the vision for this voluntary carbon market, I think it's a key aspect of also our vision for this market. And I want to emphasize the word market, because if you think about it, I think market is, it's such a global coordination problem that we face, right? The sheer scale of the challenge that we have in front of us, that I think it's very important that we really think of this as a global market, that where all these different actors, thousands of companies and Atem, Nori, etc., the demand side, the supply side, etc., where they need to come together on this global market to be able to interact with each other in an environment built on trust, right? And a big part of that trust that you need for a market to function at that scale comes from having the right type of data, from data that I can rely on, where I can see, okay, we're talking a lot about sensors nowadays, right? Where you can actually measure in a reliable way, did this carbon actually get sequestered? Did my direct air capture plant, capture the amount of carbon it claims, etc. And we believe this is going to be a big part of this future carbon market, And again, something where technology can help a lot, because if you make that data available on blockchains, on decentralized ledgers, it's easier to trust that data. There's more trust. And that, when then take Atem into consideration, where we come in and then say, okay, once we have these standards established on-chain, the type of data that you can use to verify the trading mechanisms, the marketplaces, or the avenues where you buy and sell carbon, the types of standards that exist to interact with carbon credits, Atem builds on top of that and builds the pipelines for this market in a horizontal way. And we think of this very much as a layer, technology layer in this market. And final part, that where the vision comes in, we think is all these pieces need to come together for this to be at the gigaton scale where it needs to be eventually. If we only think of this as sort of individual initiatives that don't find together in this global market and that don't speak the same language and the same sort of understanding of each other and can build upon each other, then it's going to be difficult to reach that kind of scale. And that's why we're very focused also in our vision of Atem, building, piece by piece, this technology layer to these pipelines, if you will, to bring this together.
I think it's incredibly exciting this time where this level of openness and innovation is happening in the market, because it almost feels like we're at a moment where the market as it was operating before is kind of left behind, and it's not evolving, it's kind of really becoming a new version of itself in a way. And I think this is where we also see Atem coming in, kind of being this efficient trading building brick in the market. And I would say in the future, we believe a lot in tech-based solutions and in very measurable results, and making that easy integratable into business processes.
If it's okay for you, please allow me a little bit a challenging question. Do you come purely from the technology perspective, or do you have on top of that, in addition, the ambition to ensure quality? Yeah. So really that these projects being made transparent based on the technology are really fulfilling what we learned from science. So having a quality check there as well, or just creating the transparency and doing whatever technically is possible? Any thoughts from your side about that?
I think they're related. So if you're transparently providing data and information and also looking at it, right? Like looking at how are we doing here and assessing, and the public and sector and your customers will let you know this is questionable. Oh, really? Okay, what's going on there? You can be more curious and assess.
But would you remove it then from your platform or not?
I don't know what scenario we're talking about. It's very abstract, but my primary instinct is to improve it, because the quality is always a measure. Like it is a moving threshold, and it can always get better.
Yeah.
So, for example, in the voluntary marketplace, we said, my co-founders and I created Nori in 2017 in order to improve on carbon markets. We didn't create a different solution. We created a new carbon market, so a new improvement or in the quality. And I think that providers need to have, again, that ethos in how they're operating, because, right now, when it's very complicated too for Nori with soil carbon, because a lot of it's not known. We use a model that helps to estimate carbon. We don't use soil samples. There's a bunch of disagreement on that. Some people say it's necessary. Others data shows that the error on the soil samples could be 50 to 80%, and it's not at all cohesive. So the idea is, okay, assess what your options are, make the best informed decision you can today, revisit in the future. What is there? New soil monitoring and quantification methods. Integrate that new version.
I like that approach of using the data in order to engage, to improve. Yeah, that is
exactly.
And I'll come back to you, Alexandra, on the challenges that you see for companies when they need to buy offsets.
Okay.
But before we go that, do you want to close the loop on the quality question that Daniel raised from Atem?
Absolutely. I think we have kind of one way of looking at this is we're saying we want to make it easier to do the right thing, right? And the right thing is often, as Alexandra just mentioned, it's kind of, you learn, there's new information, so the right thing changes in a way. Mm-hmm. And where we see our contribution to this very big quality issue is we're working very hard to to make the right kind of data as easily accessible as possible. We think this is a big problem in the market right now, that even if you want to do the right thing, it's complex, it's opaque. You don't really know, can I trust this, can I not? And this is where we come in as Atem, sort of that's our contribution to it. Yeah.
So coming back to the challenges, what are the main ones you can see for companies when they're buying offsets?
Oh, it's like, where do you go? It really, and it's not even clear what the options are, what the differences are. Is it an apple and orange? Are they all fruit? There's a banana. What are you looking for, right? And it's not clear for companies. There's a lack of information and education. I also think Alex brought up a point earlier where there's like a separate group, like, okay, sustainability team, go figure it out. It's not part of the company's ethos, which makes it challenging. And then I think there's just a broader challenge of the space is nascent. Our understanding as a species about our impact and how carbon in gaseous form and other greenhouse gases last or emitted or off gas from certain places, it's constantly evolving, and hopefully we can catch up. I believe we're a very intelligent species and it could be used for good or bad, and I think we'll get there. Have to stay positive. So educating buyers on fast carbon cycle emissions and slow carbon cycle emissions, that's a new thing we're going to start sharing in our rhetoric. But even before, when we started, I remember when I started to go to conferences, like sustainability conferences for corporates, and I would talk about Nori solution, and I talk about carbon removal. The look I would get was, what's the difference between that and the existing offsets? And I'm like, what do you mean it's carbon removal? What's the difference? And it didn't connect in my mind that it wasn't clear to them that there's reductions, avoidances, and that's 95% of the supply, and then 5% of them is carbon removal and emission and storage. And that is, I think, the number one key here. If anybody who's watching would take away, is there's a difference between mitigations, reducing and avoiding carbon, and those offsets, and carbon removals and sequestration. The other challenge is there's a lack of supply. This is a big supply issue. The demand side, there's plenty of organizations from startups who have very little in their budget to your largest corporations that are running the globe, looking to purchase carbon removal offsets or carbon offsets in general. But is there quality supply available that you can trust? And this is the problem that we're trying to solve. And the solution we've provided, we're starting to scale. We start working with the farmers. I said we go all the way up to the demand, but we wanted to focus on that supply problem. Luckily, we started early enough to do so. And then there's one thing I wanted to share as well, if I may. We, I mentioned it took 2 years to sell our first credit with one farmer. The next year we brought on 2 farmers. The next year it was something like 15. And now this year we announced our partnership with Bayer Crop Sciences, which will be paying their farmers to adopt regenerative agriculture practices to sequester up to 1 million tons of carbon. So we're on a campaign for 2023, and we'll be doing a end of the year recognition ceremony as well on which organizations integrated into our API to remove carbon, who purchased the most carbon, as well as individuals, because individuals can partake as well.
We created the problem, now we need to fix it, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And you mentioned large corporations. I'll go to you, Daniel. SAP has committed to achieve net zero, even 20 years earlier. So can you tell us a bit more? What are the measures you and your team are driving for the company?
Happy to do so. Let me build for a second on what you just mentioned when it comes to the challenge of avoidance reduction and real removal out of the atmosphere. From my perspective, I believe the SBTI, the Science Based Target Initiative, is very helpful because, from my understanding, they really focus now on the removal part, not allowing the others aspects to be considered on your net zero journey. And now back to your question.
Well, can I just add to that a little bit? So I remember when the SBTI initiative came out, I was very excited, and I'm glad it's around. So I'm not going to disparage it here, but I just wanted to touch on the point of what this really looks like historically in terms of evolving our thinking. When I went to the CDP workshop in 2018 in April in New York City, and there was an SBTI workshop talking about what the initiative was going to look like, there was a gentleman from an organization, a big one, asking where do offsets come into play. And they said, no, we won't accept offsets or carbon removals into the strategy of meeting SBI targets. But that changed. And now, as you said, it's a big part of the focus. And so that is a key example of organizations adopting and learning more so that we are hitting targets.
Yeah, right. Back to the net zero journey of SAP, and the beauty is that we have more than a decade of learnings, because our first emission reduction target we have established back in 2009. And it was already during that time an absolute target. It was already a target focusing on scope 1, scope 2, and in addition selected scope 3 emissions. When it comes to net zero, just to share some numbers with you that you better understand SAP's entire value chain, because net zero means, and hopefully all my peers apply the same language, yeah, net zero should mean you cover your emissions across your entire value chain. In our case, the upstream emissions coming from the purchased goods and services, that counts for less than 10%. 8, 9, 10%. The own operations count for 5%. The downstream emissions, the emissions coming from the use of SAP products, these count for more than 80%, 84%. Being for 50 years in the business, having 400,000 customers across all sectors and industries, and coming from an on-premise world, and coming from a world where software needs hardware and hardware needs energy, that is the reason why this is more than 80% of our entire value chain emissions. So back to your question, what are the key topics we need to tackle, we need to address, is of course helping our customers to transform from on-premise to the cloud. And since 2014, we always offer a green cloud, meaning that we purchase renewables of high quality to run our data centers, including our co-locations, including the hyperscalers, and the hyperscalers now as well on a good journey, and with great pledges and ambitions, which is important. So that's number one. Nevertheless, we need to continue to focus on our own supply chain and getting them on board as part of our overall net zero program, addressing the biggest 100 suppliers. When I say the biggest ones, I mean in terms of emissions, yeah, and engaging with them and being part of the SBTi movement and a carbon neutral movement, and offering us carbon neutral products and services. And then continue to, when it comes to our own operations, yeah, and a focus there where our friends from Global Facility and Real Estate Management are doing great. Our cloud operations doing great. When it comes to energy efficiency, we have in more than 50 locations an environmental management system in place, which is about continuous improvement year by year. Energy management systems in place year by year, and you need to improve and be better, and you challenge yourself. So these are the three blocks we address: the cloud movement and transformation, the own operations, and the supply chain.
Thanks for that, Daniel. And we're about to wrap up, and we're going to go back to our first question, but I'm going to ask you, each of you, if it's a yes or no, if carbon trading is actually the right strategy. But before we go there, while you think about that, I want to go to Atem again, and I'm going to ask you, how do you overcome the typical request of information, right? Which is, it's a given for large corporations to be compliant. So how do you deal with that?
I was going to, I think this ties into the challenge question as well. Like, where do we see the challenges in this market? Because one of the big challenges that we think exists currently is that this market is way too complex, way too fragmented, that it's very manual in a sense, right? We talked a bit about this separate team that exists, a separate sustainability team that, you know, these processes are often not very integrated into other business processes. And one of those aspects, you mentioned RFI, RFP, so these sort of typical quote unquote procurement processes, right? When you think about carbon credits, carbon offsets in this voluntary carbon market, that procurement runs in a very isolated, manual, calling people up, sending emails, writing, like negotiating individually, signing individual deals. And then eventually, the most important thing, actually, we haven't really talked about the retirement of carbon credits that much. The actual offset comes from kind of taking this carbon credit out of the market. That is also often done manually, and is, you know, like just way too complicated from our point of view. So how we address that as Atem is we're not saying we're trying to build this separate way of doing this. We're trying to build the technology to make the integration, or kind of take these carbon operations we talked about, to take them from their island, their separated island, and integrate them, automate them into existing processes, because that's when we believe, we will be able to scale this market, or will make it easier also for high quality supply to be funded, to be financed, right? Because you need both. You need the buyer and you need the seller and the supplier. And so if they have more efficient technology and pipelines in between, we think this will lift the whole market eventually. And that's really our long-term sort of approach there.
And I would like to add to that, because I think one of the biggest risks to evolve is that enterprises are facing this brand reputation damage. This is kind of a huge risk on their end. And for us, kind of as humans, we need them to step up. We need them to kind of come and help innovate, and not kind of retract from that and kind of wait for a couple of years, see how the market develops, and then engage again. So I think it's really important to be close together, because we need that as a lever basically to move forward.
I think both of you, Nori and Atem, are inspiration to the world, one that we have to make a better place, right? And in general, that's the main conclusion at the end. And you guys are doing everything you can in your own purposes and missions to make that happen. For everyone that's watching, let's go back to the first question and the main purpose of our conversation today. If you can tell me, Alexandra, yes or no, is carbon trading the right strategy for decarbonization? And if not or yes, tell me why.
No, it's not. And what do I define as trading? So if I took this card, this represents carbon removal, and I buy it from him. He's a farmer. Okay, now I have it as a buyer. I'm going to sell it back to you, Lourdes. That's trading.
With an SAP logo on it.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, SAP. But corporate transactions are trading of carbon. That is trading. I mean, there's a purchase and then there was a trade after the purchase. Nori is fundamentally not supportive of this, because we believe that every dollar spent on carbon should be removing additional carbon from the atmosphere. And so what we have is something very similar to what you were mentioning earlier, Christoph, which is the retirement, and we do this immediately. So anybody who purchases on Nori.com, once you buy your carbon credit or your carbon removal through Nori, what you get is your certificate, and it's automatically retired on the blockchain. That's it. It can't be counted. It can't be reused or sold. With our API, there's one of our APIs for that will be available is like a prepay, where you can buy, a bulk and then retire them on behalf of companies. So let's say SAP were to integrate into our API, the prepay API, you would purchase 1,000, and then it sits in your account, but you can't trade them. You can just change the name of retirement on behalf of, let's say, a particular customer that you want to work with or a partner.
So I got to know here, what about on this side?
Yes.
Yes, why?
Well, I think it's a necessary step, and I think the biggest challenges are also the biggest business opportunities. They have always been, and I think it's super important that it becomes something where more investment is flowing, and we see that as kind of financial flows and impact flows, and I think the trading part is a necessary step of.
I would maybe add to that. I think maybe by changing some words, right? Is it the right strategy for decarbonization? I think that's saying a lot. That's saying more than what it is, right? I would also say it's an essential part of an essential piece of a decarbonization strategy, which is or decarbonization in general, which is the voluntary carbon market. I mean, on a market, of course, naturally, there is trade. What we also don't see as helpful is the speculation maybe that might evolve from that, right? So how we look at this is we want to make it as easy as possible for supply and demand to trade with each other as directly as possible. And we see a lot of speculation in the market currently because it's so complex, because it's so opaque, right? You have actors that exploit this complexity in a way by making it very difficult to assess, is this a good price, and sort of marking up prices heavily, right? And so what you have as a result is the dollar that you spend on the credit only a fraction of that ends up in the pockets of the supplier, right? And again, we think this doesn't necessarily mean that you should trade. It just means connecting these two groups more directly, more efficiently, more transparently is important and an essential part of a functioning market.
So I guess we will wrap up the day saying that this conversation needs to continue.
Yes.
Because we got an O here, we got a yes here, or maybe it's part and an essential part of it, which I hope the audience finds this conversation as inspiring as we got it today. Please engage with us, follow us on social media, engage with the panelists today, and look forward. Thank you for making it easier. Thank you for making it a great story for farmers as well.
Thank you.
And we're all part of this. It's one planet, right? So we're all part of it. Thank you, and see you very soon.
Thanks for the invite.